My husband believed I was nothing more than decorative staff within his own company. But the exact moment he signed the order to fire me, I silently withdrew $47 million he never knew existed. By New Year's Eve, as everyone raised their champagne glasses to toast his empire, nobody realized I had already seized it. He thought he was discarding a wife, but he was actually handing over the keys. My name is Harper Wexley, and at 34 years old, I had become a ghost in the polished, frigid world of Darien, Connecticut. I had mastered the art of blending into the beige silk wallpaper of the Caldwell estate, a sprawling monument to old money that smelled perpetually of lavender and silent judgment. To the outside world, I was the fortunate wife of a real estate tycoon, living a life of leisure. Inside these walls, I was merely a prop, a piece of furniture that was occasionally expected to speak but never expected to have an opinion. "Harper, stop fidgeting with your napkin," Evelyn Caldwell said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. My mother-in-law sat at the head of the mahogany table, looking at me with that familiar cocktail of pity and disdain. "If you are going to sit at the table, at least try to look like you belong here. And check the roast. The staff is so slow tonight." I stood up silently to check the serving platter. I was not the staff. But in the Caldwell hierarchy, I ranked somewhere between the housekeeper and the antique vase in the foyer. My husband, Graham Caldwell, sat across from his mother, scrolling through his phone with a furrowed brow. He was the CEO of Caldwell Meridian, a man who wore $5,000 suits to hide the fact that his empire was rotting from the inside out. He looked up, his eyes sliding over me without actually seeing me, as if I were transparent. "Wine, Harper," Graham said, lifting his empty glass without looking at me. I poured the Pinot Noir. I worked at Caldwell Meridian, too, holding the title of internal process consultant. On paper, it sounded authoritative. In reality, Graham used me to organize his personal calendar, pick up dry cleaning, and ensure the office plants were watered. He had no idea that while I organized his files, I actually read them. I knew the debt ratios better than his CFO. "Graham," I said, keeping my voice low as I settled back into my chair. "I saw the preliminary reports for the third quarter. The cash burn on the Cobalt Harbor project is outpacing our liquidity. If we don't restructure the debt by next month..." Graham slammed his phone down on the table, the sound echoing in the dining room. "Not now, Harper." "Oh, honestly," Evelyn laughed, a dry, brittle sound. "Harper, dear, stick to what you know, which is, well, being pleasant. Leave the business to the adults. You bore us with these petty worries." I tightened my grip on the silverware until my knuckles turned white. They thought my silence was submission. They were wrong. The heavy oak doors swung open, and the temperature in the room seemed to shift. Sloane Mercer walked in. She was the new brand strategy expert Graham had hired to save the company's image. She was everything I was not supposed to be: loud, sharp, and terrifyingly confident. She tossed her coat onto a chair I had spent hours organizing earlier that day, moving through the dining room as if she held the deed to the house. "Sorry I'm late," Sloane said, not sounding sorry at all. She flashed a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I was on the phone with the zoning commission. I think I charmed them into an extension." Graham's face transformed instantly. The irritation vanished, replaced by a hungry, desperate sort of admiration. He stood up to pull out a chair for her, a courtesy he hadn't shown me in 3 years. "That is incredible news," Graham said, leaning in. "I knew you were the right hire. Sloane. Finally. Someone who understands vision." "We need to go bigger on Cobalt Harbor," Sloane said, accepting a glass of wine while ignoring my presence entirely. "The market responds to strength, Graham, not hesitation." "Exactly," Graham said, glancing at me with a sneer. "Harper was just worrying about the budget again." "Cute," Sloane said, taking a sip and looking at me like I was a lost child. "Numbers are boring, Harper. Vision is what sells. I watched them. I saw the way Graham leaned toward her, the way the air between them seemed charged with a secret electricity. They talked for an hour about spending money they did not have, while I sat in silence, cutting my meat into tiny, precise squares. When the dinner ended, I went to hang up Graham's coat in the foyer. As I lifted the heavy wool fabric, a scent hit me. It was not the cedar of our closet, nor was it his usual cologne. It was a sharp, musky floral scent, santal and jasmine. I turned my head and looked at the scarf Sloane had left on the banister. I walked over and sniffed it. It was the exact same smell. It was the scent of a woman who was always close. My husband was not just incompetent, he was a cliché. I held his coat for a second longer, breathing in the evidence of his betrayal. He thought I was just the woman who hung up his clothes. He had forgotten that I was also the woman who knew where all the bodies were buried. At 2 a.m, the Caldwell estate was finally quiet. Graham was asleep in the master bedroom, his phone face down on the nightstand, likely vibrating with late-night messages he thought I did not notice. I slipped out of bed and put on my robe, moving silently through the hallway like the ghost they all treated me as. I made my way down to the garage. To anyone looking, it was just a high-end storage space for Graham's collection of vintage cars that he rarely drove. But behind a stack of winter tires and a dusty shelving unit filled with old gardening tools, there was a reinforced steel door that looked like a maintenance closet. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner disguised as a light switch. The lock clicked open with a soft mechanical hum. This was my sanctuary. Inside, there were no dusty boxes or forgotten holiday decorations. It was a compact, climate-controlled server room with 3 high-definition monitors glowing in the dark. I sat down in the ergonomic chair and exhaled, feeling the tension of the dutiful wife role slide off my shoulders. Here, I was not Harper the accessory. I was the architect of Lumen Rail. I did not hack bank accounts or steal corporate secrets. I did something far more lucrative and entirely legal. 5 years ago, I developed an algorithm capable of optimizing real-time energy pricing for freight rail logistics. It was a boring, complex piece of math that saved massive corporations billions of dollars in fuel costs. I had patented it under a shell company incorporated in Delaware called Knightbridge Holdings. System status check, I whispered to myself, typing the command sequence. The screens flooded with data streams. Green lines of code cascaded down the center monitor. To Graham, I was a woman who could barely operate the smart oven. He had no idea that Knightbridge Holdings was currently licensing my technology to 3 of the largest logistics firms on the East Coast. I had built this escape hatch years ago, right around the time Graham started coming home late smelling of other women's perfume. I knew a man like him loved power more than he could ever love a person. If he knew about Lumen Rail, he would not just take the money, he would take the credit. He would turn my brilliance into his trophy. A notification chimed, sharp and clear in the silence. It was an email from Arclight Dominion, a massive energy conglomerate. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened the message. Subject final acquisition and exclusivity terms. I read the subject line aloud, my voice trembling slightly. I scanned the legal jargon until my eyes landed on the settlement figure. They wanted exclusive rights to the Lumen Rail code effective immediately upon signature. The transfer amount was staggering. $47 million. I breathed out. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the number. $47 million in liquid cash. The contract stated the funds would be deposited into the Knightbridge Holdings escrow account on December 31st, pending my digital signature. December 31st. I swiveled my chair toward the digital calendar on the side screen. That date was circled in red. It was the night of the annual Caldwell Gala in Park City, Utah. Graham had been talking about it for weeks. He called it the night of the comeback, where he planned to dazzle investors and secure the capital needed to save his crumbling Cobalt Harbor project. He and his mother were planning to parade me around as the silent, supportive wife while they begged for money to cover their incompetence. "They want a show," I said softly, a cold smile touching my lips. "They want everyone looking at them when the clock strikes midnight." I looked back at the email. The funds would be available for immediate withdrawal the moment the ball dropped. I could move $47 million with a single keystroke while Graham was busy toasting to a future he did not actually own. "You want to be the king of the world." "Graham," I whispered to the empty room. "But you forgot to check who owns the castle." I reached out and typed a quick reply to the lawyers at Arclight Dominion. "Proceed with drafting. I will be ready to sign." I closed the laptop and stood up. The garage was cold, but I felt a fire burning in my chest. They had chosen the stage in Park City. They had invited the audience. All I had to do was step into the spotlight at the exact right second. The atmosphere in the mahogany-paneled study was suffocating. Graham threw a thick stack of documents onto the desk with a heavy thud, the sound echoing like a gavel striking a block. He did not sit down. He paced back and forth, loosening his tie with a jerky, irritated motion. "I need you to sign these, Harper," Graham said, not looking at me. "It is just standard compliance paperwork for the bank. They are withholding the next tranche of funding for Cobalt Harbor until all officer spouses sign off on the liability structures." I sat in the leather wingback chair, pulling the documents toward me. The header read Caldwell Meridian, Spousal Consent and Compliance Agreement. It looked boring. It looked routine. It was designed to look that way. But as I scanned the second paragraph, the legal jargon sharpened into focus. It was not a compliance form. It was a waiver. If I signed this as it stood, I was agreeing to waive all claims to marital assets in the event of a corporate restructuring or dissolution. I was also agreeing to assume joint liability for specific lines of credit without any decision-making power. It was a trap. He was preparing to divorce me, but he wanted to strip me of every penny and saddle me with his debt before he kicked me out. "Graham," I said, my voice intentionally small. This says something about waiving rights to equitable distribution. Is that normal?" Evelyn was standing by the fireplace, sipping a martini. She let out a sigh that sounded like a tire-losing air. "Oh, for heaven's sake! Harper," Evelyn snapped. "Sign the papers. You have been living off Graham's hard work for years. Do not pretend you understand complex banking covenants. If you keep holding this up, you are personally jeopardizing the family legacy. I looked at Graham, widening my eyes to look overwhelmed. "I feel a bit dizzy. The words are blurring together. Graham, could I please have a glass of water?" Graham rolled his eyes, a look of pure exasperation crossing his face. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "Fine. Do not move. We have to courier this out in 20 minutes. He turned and marched out of the room toward the kitchen. Evelyn followed him to the doorway, likely to complain about my incompetence. I had 15 seconds. I did not panic. I did not shake. I reached into my slim leather portfolio that I had placed on the floor. I pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was printed on the exact same high-quality bond paper as Graham's contract. The font was identical. The margins were perfect. I flipped to page 4 of Graham's stack, the section detailing asset definitions and liability assignments, and slipped my page in between the existing sheets. My page was an addendum. It stated 3 things very clearly in dense legalese. First, that any intellectual property or revenue streams generated independently by the spouse remained sole and separate property, immune to marital seizure. Second, that any new debt incurred by Caldwell Meridian from this date forward was the sole responsibility of the CEO. And third, the most dangerous clause of all, the right of first refusal. It granted me the legal priority to purchase any distressed debt of the company before it could be offered to third-party collectors. I smoothed the papers back down just as Graham walked back in. "Here," he said, slamming a crystal glass down on a coaster. "Drink, then sign." I took a sip, my hand trembling slightly. It was a performance. Thank you, Graham. I am sorry. I want to help. If you want to help, stop reading and start writing, Evelyn said from the doorway. I picked up the pen. I signed the signature page at the back. Then I pushed the stack toward Graham. I signed, I said softly, but the bank usually requires the CEO to initial the liability pages too, right? To show you acknowledge the spousal consent. Graham huffed, grabbing the pen from my hand. You are suddenly an expert on bank procedure. I heard the auditors say it once, I murmured, looking down at my lap. Graham flipped through the pages rapidly. He stopped at page 4, my page. He did not read a single word. He saw the Caldwell Meridian header, assumed it was the same trash he had printed out, scrawled his initials at the bottom, and flipped to the next. He had just signed away his safety net. He finished initialing and tossed the pen onto the desk. Done. Finally. He gathered the papers, tapping them on the desk to straighten the edges. He was holding his own death warrant, and he was treating it like a victory. I stood up, smoothing my skirt. I signed it. Graham, I hope it helps you get what you deserve. Yeah, Graham said, already turning away to put the documents in a courier envelope. Go to bed, Harper. I walked out of the study, past Evelyn, who was glaring at me over her glass. I did not look back. I walked up the stairs, my heart beating with a steady, rhythmic thrum. He thought he had just disarmed me. He had no idea he had just handed me the weapon. The notification hit my phone on a Tuesday morning while I was organizing the pantry. It was a withdrawal alert from the joint account Graham thought I never checked. $18,900 paid to Vanderhoven Jewelers. I looked down at my own wrist, bare and unadorned. My birthday was months away, and our anniversary had passed with nothing more than a generic card signed by his assistant. 2 days later, I saw exactly where that money had gone. Evelyn was hosting her monthly social tea in the conservatory, a suffocating event where women in pastel suits drank Earl Grey and judged each other's net worth. Sloane Mercer was there, of course. She sat next to Evelyn, holding court. As she reached for a scone, the sunlight caught the platinum bangle on her wrist. It was encrusted with pavé diamonds, a distinctive design I had seen in the catalog Graham left on his desk. We are pivoting the brand toward a holistic luxury experience, Sloane said, waving her hand so the diamonds sparkled for everyone to see. It is about elevating the narrative. The women nodded, mesmerized. They did not hear the emptiness of her words. They only saw the confidence of a woman who felt untouchable. Evelyn beamed at her, then cast a sideways glance at me as I refilled the teapots. Sloane has such vision, Evelyn announced. Unlike some, she understands that you have to spend money to project power. I said nothing. I just poured the tea. But inside, I was not sulking. I was memorizing the date of the purchase and cross-referencing it with Graham's claim that he had been in meetings all day. Later that evening, I passed the library. The door was cracked open, spilling a sliver of yellow light into the hallway. I heard the clinking of crystal glasses and Graham's low laugh. You have to be patient, Sloane, Graham said. Divorce is messy. The lawyers, the optics. It takes time to move assets around. I am tired of waiting. Graham. Sloane's voice was petulant. She is always there, looking at me with those big, empty eyes. Does she suspect anything? Harper. Graham scoffed, a sound that made my stomach turn. Harper is harmless. She is easy to control. As long as she has a roof over her head and a schedule to keep, she won't ask questions. She is basically furniture. I stepped back into the shadows. A year ago, that would have broken my heart. Tonight, it just clarified my timeline. I went straight to my laptop. I did not cry. I opened a new spreadsheet. I started pulling everything. I downloaded credit card statements, highlighting every dinner, every hotel stay, and every gift that coincided with his business trips. But as I dug deeper into the server to find his travel logs, I found something far worse than infidelity. I found the real books for the Cobalt Harbor project. Graham and his CFO were cooking the ledger. They were capitalizing maintenance costs as improvements to inflate the asset value. They were projecting revenue from tenants who had not even signed letters of intent. The $19 million in secured contracts he had boasted about to the board was a complete fabrication. He wasn't just cheating on me, he was committing securities fraud. I picked up my encrypted phone and dialed a number I had saved for a worst-case scenario. "Carver and Slate," a deep voice answered on the second ring. "Miles," I said, my voice steady. "It is Harper. I have the files. It is not just a divorce case anymore. It is corporate malfeasance." I met Miles Carver an hour later in a diner 3 towns over. He was a shark of a lawyer, the kind who wore sharp suits and smiled only when he smelled blood. He reviewed the printouts I slid across the table, his eyes scanning the falsified projections. "This is leverage," Miles said, tapping the paper. "But listen to me. Harper, do not blow this up because you are hurt. Do not scream at him. Do not throw the jewelry in his face." "I want him to hurt," I said. "He will," Miles replied, looking me dead in the eye. "But you do not need to fight with emotion. You need to fight with structure. We let him think he is safe until the trap is completely shut." I went home and printed one final folder. I labeled it simply New Year's Leverage. I walked into Graham's home office and placed the folder on the very bottom of his to-do pile, buried beneath the mundane tasks he would ignore until it was too late. It sat there, innocent and deadly, a detonator waiting for the right hand to press it. The fluorescent lights in the main conference room hummed with a low, menacing energy. The entire senior staff of Caldwell Meridian was seated around the long oval table, their faces a mixture of boredom and anxiety. I sat near the back, clutching my notepad, trying to blend into the gray upholstery. Graham stood at the head of the room, radiating a manic sort of confidence. Next to him, sitting in the chair usually reserved for the chief financial officer, was Sloane. She looked like a predator who had just been fed, leaning back with a smug, satisfied smile plastered across her face. "We are entering a new era," Graham announced, his voice booming. "To save Cobalt Harbor, we need agility. We need vision. That is why I am formally appointing Sloane Mercer as our Chief Strategy Officer." A ripple of uneasy applause went through the room. Sloane nodded, accepting the tribute as if it were her birthright. Then, Graham turned his eyes toward me. It was not a look of love, or even recognition. It was the look a man gives a stain on his shirt. "As part of this restructuring," Graham continued, his tone dropping to a clinical chill, "we are eliminating redundancies in our operational processes. Harper, please stand up." My heart hammered against my ribs, but I pushed my chair back and stood. The room went dead silent. Everyone looked at me, the invisible wife, the office gopher, the decorative object. "Your position as internal process consultant is no longer compatible with the new vision of this company," Graham said. He did not stutter. He did not look away. He fired me in front of 50 people. "Effective immediately. Your contract is terminated." I felt the blood drain from my face. It was not the firing that stung. It was the theater of it. He wanted to break me publicly. He wanted to show Sloane, and the world, that he had cut the dead weight. Sloane tilted her head, her voice dripping with poisonous sweetness. "Oh, honey, do not look so shocked. Honestly, you should be relieved. You should go home and rest. This level of business requires a speed that is just a bit too much for you." From the back of the room, the double doors opened. Evelyn Caldwell stepped in. She had not come for a meeting. She had come for the show. She crossed her arms, her eyes gleaming with triumph. "It is for the best, Harper," Evelyn called out, her voice carrying over the silence. "Graham needs a partner who can run with him. not someone he has to drag along. Graham pressed a button on the intercom. Security. 2 uniformed guards stepped into the room. I knew one of them Jerry. I had asked about his daughter's braces just last week. Now, he looked at the floor, unable to meet my eyes. Escort Ms. Wexley to the exit, Graham ordered. Collect her badge. Ensure she takes no proprietary data. He was treating me like a corporate spy, like a criminal. I did not cry. I did not scream. I slowly unclipped my badge and placed it on the table. The plastic clicked against the wood, a sharp sound in the quiet room. I looked at Graham one last time. Graham, I said, my voice steady, cutting through the tension. Are you sure about this? This is your signature on the termination order? Graham laughed. It was a short, barking sound. Of course I am sure. Just go, Harper. You have nothing to threaten me with. You have nothing to make me lose. Goodbye, Graham, I said softly. I turned and walked out. Jerry walked a step behind me, murmuring an apology I barely heard. We walked past the staring receptionists, past the glass lobby, and out into the biting cold of the parking lot. The heavy glass doors slid shut behind me, sealing my past life inside. I stood by my car, the wind whipping my hair across my face. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out. The screen glowed with a notification from the escrow service. Funds eligible for release upon instruction. I looked back at the towering glass building of Caldwell Meridian, up on the top floor. They were likely popping champagne, celebrating the removal of the useless wife. They thought they had just thrown me out into the cold. They had no idea they had just set me free. Instruction confirmed, I whispered to the empty air. I tapped the screen. $47 million began its journey. The game had officially changed. I sat in the driver's seat of my sedan, the engine idling. My hands were steady on the steering wheel, a stark contrast to the adrenaline flooding my veins. I dialed Miles Carver. He answered on the first ring. Kick it off, I said, my voice cutting through the silence of the car. Activate the disbursement clause. Now. Are you sure? Miles asked, though I could hear the rapid clicking of his keyboard in the background. Once I execute this, there is no going back. The tax implications alone are— I do not care about the taxes, I interrupted. I care about the timing. Move the money. Done. Miles said a moment later. $47 million has been successfully transferred from the escrow account into Knightbridge Holdings. It is clean, legal, and completely untouchable. I did not celebrate. The money was not for vacations or jewelry. It was ammunition. Good, I said. Now! I need you to contact the syndicate holding the primary construction loan for Caldwell Meridian, the one Graham used to leverage the Cobalt Harbor project. I am already looking at their file. Miles replied, They are nervous. Rumors of the audit are leaking. They are terrified of a default. They should be, I said. Caldwell Meridian is not just cash poor. They are facing a cross-default scenario. If they miss the interest payment on the equipment lease, it triggers a freeze on the voting rights of the board. Graham is sitting on a powder keg. And you want to light the match? Miles asked. No, I corrected him. I want to own the powder keg. Contact the bank. Tell them a private equity firm is willing to buy the distressed debt for 60 cents on the dollar. They will take the loss just to get the risk off their books before the fiscal year ends. Harper, Miles said, his tone shifting to one of professional admiration. You are using the right of first refusal clause, the one Graham signed in the study. Exactly, I said. That addendum gives me the legal priority to purchase any debt obligations before they go to market. He thought he was signing a waiver. He was signing away his shield. We need a front, Miles said. We cannot use your name. If Graham sees Harper Wexley on the transfer documents, he will tie this up in family court for years. Iron Cove Capital, I said instantly. Register it in Delaware. Use the 48-hour disclosure grace period. By the time he finds out who really owns Iron Cove, the ink will be dry. Iron Cove Capital, Miles repeated, testing the name. It sounds predatory. I like it. But Harper, if we buy this debt, we control the covenants. We can force immediate repayment. No, I said. We do not want repayment. We want control. Draft the acquisition terms. Condition 1, absolute protection for the general staff. No layoffs for anyone below the director level. Condition 2, immediate suspension of all executive perks, including the corporate jet and the expense accounts. You are not just burning him down, Miles mused. You are seizing the kingdom. He built a company on the backs of people he treats like dirt, I said, watching the snow begin to fall on the windshield. I am going to show him how it is actually run. Get the papers ready. There is one problem, Miles warned. Once Iron Cove executes the buy, Graham will spin this. He will go to the press and claim it is a hostile takeover by faceless vultures. He will play the victim to save his reputation. He can try, I said. But he needs a stage to do that. You need a moment, Miles said. A public moment to lock the board down before he can spin the narrative. You need to be in the room when the hammer drops. I looked down at the passenger seat. Lying there was the printed itinerary for the Caldwell New Year's Eve Gala in Park City, Utah. It was the event of the season, the place where Graham planned to charm his way out of bankruptcy. He invited the world to watch his triumph, I said, putting the car into gear. So let us meet at New Year's. I will have the papers waiting, Miles said. I hung up and drove out of the parking lot. The $47 million was safe. The debt purchase was in motion. Iron Cove Capital was born. I was no longer a wife. I was the majority creditor. The Summit Crest Grand Hotel in Park City was a glowing fortress of timber and glass, perched against the snowy mountainside like a crown jewel. It was the kind of place where the air smelled of pine and money, and where a single night cost more than most people earned in a month. This was the stage Graham had chosen for his resurrection. Inside the ballroom, the chandeliers were dimmed to a golden haze, casting a flattering light on the desperation that permeated the room. I was not inside yet, but I knew exactly how the scene was unfolding. I knew Graham. He stood near the ice sculpture, one hand resting possessively on Sloane's lower back. They were posing for the society photographers, playing the role of the modern power couple to perfection. Graham wore a velvet tuxedo that screamed arrogance, and Sloane was draped in a silver gown that clung to her like a second skin. She laughed at something a banker said, throwing her head back to expose the long line of her throat, making sure the diamonds I had paid for caught the light. Evelyn was holding court near the bar, swirling a glass of champagne. She leaned in toward the wife of a venture capitalist, her voice carrying that distinct tone of superior relief. It is just so refreshing to see Graham with someone who actually understands the lifestyle, Evelyn said, loud enough for half the room to hear. Finally, my son has a woman worthy of the Caldwell name. Harper was always so, well, let us just say she was better suited for housekeeping than hosting. But the atmosphere was brittle. The investors in the room were not there for the shrimp cocktail. They were there because they smelled blood. A gray-haired man named Marcus Thorne, who managed a hedge fund that held a significant portion of Caldwell Meridian's short-term debt, stepped into Graham's circle. He did not smile. The champagne is excellent, Graham, Marcus said, his voice flat. But I am more interested in the liquidity variance report I received this morning. You are burning cash at a rate that is frankly alarming. How do you plan to service the bond yield due in February? Graham stiffened, though his smile remained plastered on his face. Beads of sweat began to form along his hairline. Marcus, you are looking at old data. We are currently leveraging our equity in the Cobalt Harbor land to bridge the gap. It is all under control. Leveraging equity. Marcus raised an eyebrow. That land is already double mortgaged. Sloane, sensing the tension and desperate to prove her worth, stepped forward. She placed a hand on Marcus's arm, a gesture that was too familiar and entirely unprofessional. You are thinking too traditionally. Marcus, Sloane said, her voice dripping with condescension. The real value is not in the land. It is in the brand equity we are building. Once we capitalize the operational overhead as a revenue stream, the books will balance themselves. The circle of men went silent. Marcus looked at Sloane, then back at Graham, a small, incredulous smile touching his lips. Capitalize overhead as revenue. Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. My dear, that is not innovative accounting. That is fraud, and it is also mathematically impossible. Sloane's smile faltered. She pulled her hand back as if she had been burned. The investors exchanged glances, taking a collective step back from the couple. The skepticism in the room was shifting into open mockery. Just then, a ripple went through the crowd. Phones began to light up in pockets and purses. A priority alert from the banking sector was circulating. It was a notification that the primary lender for Caldwell Meridian was initiating a 24-hour credit freeze pending a solvency review. Graham felt his own phone vibrate. He checked the screen, and for a split second, the color drained from his face. He looked like a man who had just heard the executioner's footsteps, but his pride was a stubborn thing. He raised his glass high, his voice cracking slightly. To Caldwell Meridian, an empire that never falls. Only a few people raised their glasses. The rest just watched him. Outside, the heavy tires of my black sedan crunched over the fresh snow. I did not bring a driver. I drove myself. I handed the keys to the valet, who took one look at me and straightened his posture. I was not wearing a gown. I was wearing a tailored white suit, sharp enough to cut, with no jewelry except for a simple watch. I walked through the revolving doors and into the lobby. The heat of the hotel hit me, but I felt cold, focused, and terrifyingly calm. I could hear the murmur of the party down the hall. They were waiting for a savior, or a victim. I was neither. I stopped at the entrance to the ballroom, looking up at the gold-plated sign that read, Caldwell Meridian, New Year's Gala. Showtime, I whispered. I pushed the doors open. I did not just walk into the room. I invaded it. The silence did not happen immediately. It rippled through the ballroom like a cold wave, starting from the entrance and washing over the crowd until the clinking of crystal glasses and the murmur of polite conversation died out completely. I walked into the center of the room. I was not wearing the pastel, modest dresses Evelyn had forced on me for years. I was wearing a structured white suit that cost more than my first car, tailored to sharp, terrifying perfection. My hair was slicked back, my makeup minimal but severe. I did not look at the floor. I did not look for permission. I looked straight ahead, walking through the parted crowd like Moses splitting the Red Sea. Evelyn was the first to break the shock. She slammed her champagne flute down on a passing waiter's tray, the glass shattering. "Security!" Evelyn shrieked, her voice cracking with indignation. "Get this woman out of here! She is trespassing Graham! Do something!" Graham stepped out from the circle of investors, his face flushing a deep, angry red. He marched toward me, grabbing my arm hard enough to bruise. "Have you lost your mind?" Graham hissed through his teeth, his eyes darting around to see who was watching. "Embarrassing me at home wasn't enough. You had to come here and make a scene. Get out, Harper. You are making a fool of yourself." I looked down at his hand on my arm, then up at his eyes. I did not pull away. I just stared at him until he released me, unsettled by a coldness he had never seen in me before. "I did not come to crash your party, Graham," I said, my voice calm and carrying clearly in the silent room. "I came to inspect. My asset." "Your asset?" Graham laughed, a nervous barking sound. "You do not own a damn thing. You are destitute." Before he could continue, a man stepped out from the shadows of the VIP section. It was Caleb Rivington. Graham had spent 3 years chasing Caleb, sending gifts, begging for meetings, trying to get a fraction of his infrastructure fund to back Caldwell Meridian. Graham's face lit up with desperate hope. Caleb, Graham said, smoothing his jacket. I apologize for this interruption. My ex-wife is just leaving. Caleb Rivington did not even look at Graham. He walked right past him and stopped in front of me. He extended a hand. Ms. Wexley, Caleb said, his tone respectful and serious. It is an honor. My team at the fund verified the transfer this morning. Iron Cove has successfully secured the controlling interest in the primary loan facility. The room went so quiet you could hear the wind howling outside the glass walls. Thank you. Mr. Rivington, I said, shaking his hand. I appreciate your team's discretion during the transition. Wait, Graham stammered, looking between us. Caleb, what are you talking about Iron Cove? That is the Vulture Fund buying up the debt. What does Harper have to do with them? The side doors opened, and Miles Carver walked in. He was flanked by two paralegals carrying thick leather binders. He didn't look like a divorce lawyer tonight. He looked like an executioner. He walked straight to the audio-visual booth and nodded to the technician. The giant projection screen behind the stage, which had been displaying a looping video of Graham's face, flickered and changed. It was replaced by a stark, black-and-white legal document, Notice of Change in Creditor, Representative, and Assumption of Governance Rights. What is that? Someone in the crowd whispered. That, I said, turning to address the room, is the legal notification that Iron Cove Capital has purchased the $40 million of distressed debt Caldwell Meridian failed to service. And as the sole owner of Iron Cove Capital, I am calling the loan. Sloane pushed her way to the front, her face pale beneath her layers of makeup. She pointed a shaking finger at me. That is a lie, Sloane screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. She is a secretary. She makes coffee. She does not have that kind of money. Graham, tell them she is lying. But no one was looking at Sloane. The investors were pulling out their phones, checking the debt markets, reading the emails that were hitting their inboxes at that exact moment. They saw the truth in the data. I took a step closer to Graham. He looked small now, deflated in his velvet tuxedo, stripping away the arrogance to reveal the terrified boy underneath. You spent years telling me I was worthless, I said, leaning in so only he could hear the edge in my voice. You thought you could throw me away to save your ego, but you made a miscalculation. Graham, I glanced at the screen, then back at him. You fired the wrong person, I whispered. You fired the only person who could have saved you. Under the terms of the standing credit agreement, I said, my voice cutting through the murmurs like a scalpel. Any breach of the debt service coverage ratio allows the primary creditor to appoint an interim restructuring officer. And since Graham has been falsifying the liquidity reports for 6 months, that breach is active as of right now. As if on cue, a synchronized chiming sound filled the room. It was the sound of 20 phones receiving a priority email at the exact same second. The members of the board of directors, who were scattered around the room holding half-empty glasses of scotch, pulled out their devices. I watched their faces turn pale. It was an emergency summons. You cannot do this, Graham stammered, his hands shaking as he reached for me. You are bluffing. You are just trying to scare me. I do not bluff, Graham, I replied calmly. I execute. I nodded to the technician again. The screen shifted. It was no longer a financial document. It was a side-by-side comparison of 2 presentation decks. On the left was Sloane's revolutionary brand strategy for Caldwell Meridian. On the right was a pitch deck from a defunct startup in Silicon Valley dated 4 years ago. The graphics, the text, even the fonts were identical. And regarding your new chief strategy officer, I continued, turning to look at Sloane, who was now trembling so hard her champagne glass was rattling against her ring. It appears her entire strategic vision was copy-pasted from a failed venture. She did not write a single word of it. She is not a visionary. Graham, she is a fraud. The room gasped. In this world, infidelity was forgivable, but intellectual theft was a death sentence. Marcus Thorne, The hedge fund manager who had questioned Graham earlier set his glass down on a waiter's tray with a decisive clink. "I am withdrawing my soft commitment," Marcus announced loudly. "I will not have my fund associated with plagiarism and insolvency." "Me as well," another investor shouted from the back. "I want my term sheet pulled." "Wait, please, just listen," Graham yelled, spinning around to face them, but they were already turning their backs. He was being starved of capital in real time, right in the middle of his own party. Suddenly, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was warm, trembling, and disgustingly familiar. Evelyn Caldwell was standing there, tears welling up in her eyes, tears that I knew she could summon on command. "Harper, darling," Evelyn choked out, trying to pull me into a hug. "Oh, thank God you are here. I knew you were smart. I always told Graham you were the brains. Please, you are family. We can fix this. You are my daughter." I stepped back, letting her arms fall into empty air. I looked at her with zero emotion. "Stop acting, Evelyn," I said cold. "You spent 10 years treating me like furniture. Do not pretend I am family now that I own the house." Evelyn recoiled as if I had slapped her, her mask of civility shattering into pure shock. Graham, seeing his mother fail, tried a different tactic. He lunged forward, grabbing my hands, his eyes wide and wet. "Harper, baby, please," he pleaded, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "We are husband and wife. Everything I have is yours anyway. We can rule this together. Just tell them to stop. Tell them it is a misunderstanding." Miles Carver stepped between us, holding up a file folder like a shield. "Actually, Mr. Caldwell," Miles said smoothly, "according to the addendum you signed last month, Ms. Wexley's assets are entirely separate, and since you signed the waiver of marital interest to secure what you thought was bank compliance, you have no legal claim to Iron Cove Capital. You are not partners. You are just a debtor." Graham froze. He looked at the document, then at me. The realization hit him. The compliance paperwork he had dismissed was the very thing that was now strangling him. "And one last thing," I said, pointing to the diamond bangle on Sloane's wrist. "That bracelet, $19,000, purchased from the joint account on November 14th. The crowd turned their phone cameras toward Sloane. The flashlights were blinding. Sloane stammered, clutching her wrist. "Graham gave it to me. He said it was a business expense." Graham, realizing he was sinking, made a split-second decision. He pointed a finger at Sloane, his face twisted in ugly self-preservation. "She made me do it," Graham shouted, his voice cracking. "She manipulated the books. She told me we had the money. I am the victim here. She is the one who seduced me and ruined this company." Sloane's eyes went wide. The shock turned instantly into a feral rage. She was not going to be the scapegoat. "You coward!" Sloane screamed, lunging at him. "You begged me to stay. You told me Harper was a boring, frigid housewife you only kept around for the image. You slept with me in her bed while she was at her mother's funeral. Do not you dare put this on me." The room erupted. The cameras were rolling. Graham's power couple image dissolved into a shouting match of sordid, humiliating details. He looked around for help, but there was none. His mother was sobbing into a napkin. His investors were leaving. His mistress was exposing his darkest secrets to the internet. I did not smile. I did not frown. I just looked down at my watch. The second hand was ticking toward midnight. The fireworks were about to start outside. But the real explosion had already happened. "Almost time," I whispered to myself. 10, 9, 8. The chant filled the ballroom, vibrating against the crystal chandeliers. The guests were ready to welcome the new year, desperate to wash away the awkwardness of the last hour with champagne and noise. But I was not done. I signaled the audio technician to cut the music. The countdown died in a confused murmur as I stepped up to the microphone. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I apologize for the interruption, I said, my voice echoing through the silent hall. But the board of directors has just completed an emergency electronic vote. I am here to read the resolution. Graham stood frozen near the stage, his face the color of ash. He looked like a man waking up from a nightmare only to realize he was still in it. Effective immediately. I read from the tablet in my hand. Mr. Graham Caldwell is suspended from his position as CEO pending a forensic audit. The board cites a gross violation of risk disclosure obligations and a complete loss of creditor confidence. A collective gasp swept through the room. Graham swayed, gripping the edge of a table to steady himself. Furthermore, I continued, looking straight at him, as the representative of the majority debt holder, I have been appointed as the interim restructuring officer. This company is no longer yours. Graham, it is under new management. Graham stumbled forward, his eyes wet and terrified. He looked at the investors who had turned their backs, then at his mother who was sobbing silently, and finally at me. He realized he had no allies left. Harper, Graham whispered, his voice cracking. What do you want? Do you want to ruin me? Is that it? I lowered the microphone and stepped to the edge of the stage so I could look down at him. I do not want to ruin you, Graham, I said calmly. I want this company to live, and for that to happen, I want you out of it. Miles Carver stepped forward, placing a thin leather folder on the table next to Graham. It contained 2 documents, a separation agreement and an uncontested divorce filing. The terms are simple, I said. You sign the divorce papers and resign voluntarily. In exchange, Iron Cove Capital will not pursue criminal charges for the $19 million you defrauded from the investors. You walk away with your freedom, but nothing else. Graham looked at the papers. He looked at me. He finally understood the scope of what I had done. The $47 million I had withdrawn was never the point. It was just the ammunition. The real weapon was the control he had blindly signed over to me weeks ago in his study, thinking I was too stupid to understand legal jargon. And what about the employees? A voice called out from the back. It was the VP of Operations, a man Graham had planned to fire next week to save money. I turned to the crowd, addressing the hundreds of terrified staff members who thought they were about to lose their livelihoods. There will be no layoffs, I announced clearly. The bonuses Graham withheld will be paid out on Friday. To fund this, we are immediately liquidating the executive aviation account and terminating all C-suite expense privileges. The room erupted. It was not polite applause. It was a roar of relief and approval. In 10 seconds, the loyalty of the entire room shifted. They did not care about Graham's legacy. They cared about who signed the checks, and they knew exactly who was in charge now. Sloane tried to shrink into the background, moving toward the exit. But Miles nodded to the security team. Ms. Mercer, the head of security said, stepping in her path. You are no longer an employee or a guest. Please escort yourself out before we assist you. Sloane looked around for someone to save her, but the guests parted like she was contagious. No one looked at her. That was her punishment. She thrived on attention, and I had just made her invisible. She pushed through the doors and vanished into the cold night, leaving nothing behind but the scent of expensive perfume and failure. Happy New Year, someone shouted as the clock struck midnight. Fireworks exploded outside the massive glass windows, painting the snow in bursts of red and gold. Under the cover of the noise, Graham picked up the pen. His hand shook violently. He signed the resignation. Then, he signed the divorce papers. He handed the folder to me. He looked like a hollow shell. It is over, Graham said, his voice barely audible. I took the folder. I did not gloat. I did not smile. I just nodded, the same way I would acknowledge a completed transaction. Yes, I said, it is. I turned my back on him and walked through the cheering crowd. I walked past Evelyn, who could not even lift her head. I walked out of the ballroom, through the lobby, and out into the biting wind of the hotel driveway. The valet pulled my car around, but I waved him off. A black town car was waiting. I slid into the back seat, placing the folder on the leather beside me. "Where to?" "Ms. Wexley," the driver asked. I looked out at the snow falling on Park City. The air was cold and clean. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with freedom. "Take me to the airport," I said. "I just took back my life, and I have an empire to run." Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below, sharing your location and your thoughts on Harper's Revenge. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the Victoria Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button to help this story reach even more people.